you have that ability to do something a little different in the middle, which is this idea of I'm going to borrow that. And all of the changes I make to it as I use that component as a dependency in my product, I need to get those changes back upstream as quickly as possible because
Well, I mean, I do think so. It's interesting. What I've seen two, three, maybe if I talk about three types of scenarios in terms of the relationship between inner source and open source. The first is where someone,
and if they want to use it to bring, air gap software for their own needs and for their own purposes, they can do that too. And their government is more threatened by that than our government is, and so it kind of like evens out in the end.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
open source is great collaboration.
open source is good engineering.
Open source is not a business model.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Yeah, let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
In this segment, Stephen Walli talks about why and how to invest in open source. So it kind of seems like that the system is working. At the same time, we just had Open Source Summit North America 2024, and there were numerous presentations and panel discussions about how to describe it to your manager that participating in these open source projects is an investment. It's a risk if you don't do that. So to me, it feels like that there is a disconnect somewhere.
Yep, absolutely.
What is your experience? Like, have you ever convinced anyone in an organization that this is not like for the greater good to do, but this is the most reasonable thing for us to do, for instance?
So there's kind of two different ways that you approach that discussion. On the front end, before you do anything, it goes back to that idea I was talking about of build versus buy. Every engineering manager, every product manager understands the build versus buy decision. Are we going to hire developers to write all of that software, or does that component is something we license from somebody else? With an open source licensed bucket of software, you have that ability to do something a little different in the middle, which is this idea of I'm going to borrow that. And all of the changes I make to it as I use that component as a dependency in my product, I need to get those changes back upstream as quickly as possible because I don't want to live on a fork that's becoming more and more brittle as that upstream project continues to evolve. And I'm sitting here with a whole bunch of patches that I have to manage. And so there's this idea of instead of build versus buy, there's this idea of build versus buy versus borrow and share, because I need to be sharing my changes upstream. There is an argument that says, if you're clever about this, and for a long time Google was, if you remember early Google history, Google was reviled in the Linux community because they weren't sharing their changes back to the community. But that's because those differences, like they were differentiating for what Google was doing. And so that idea that they were actually withholding something, they were willing to eat the cost of living on a fork and doing their own complex fork management because it was a differentiator in their business. Most of us don't live like that. Most of us live in the space of, build versus buy versus borrow and share. And even in the Linux space, there was I attended a talk, and at the time, this was back around 2006, SUSE was owned by Novell at the time. And the Novell product VP, VP of all of their Linux products, he laughed because he said in that year he had to go through his own kind of self-education and realization that when he started in this role, it's like, why are you trying to contribute all those changes back? My God, this is our engineering, greatness here kind of thing. Stop doing that. And he said somewhere, he doesn't know really where, somewhere over that year though, he was suddenly horrified. Why aren't they accepting our changes upstream kind of thing? That he'd gone through that transition. But I think just approaching the discussion right off from the front of we could build it, we could buy it, or we're going to start with that rich starting point over there and contribute back. But and contributing back. So that's the next part of the discussion. This is the really hard one. And it drives me nuts because I've encountered it inside of Microsoft in the last 7 years. I've seen it in lots of places. And there is still this naive belief that there's this magical community out there that does stuff. And so people will reach into a bucket of open source licensed software, and that's the entire thinking. Well, it was open source licensed. And you've now taken a dependency, possibly on mission critical, business critical software, whether you're an IT shop or whether you're embedding it in customer facing product. And apparently the only thinking you did is, hey, this stuff was free on the internet. And like I try and help folks over that when I'm doing some of the education work in universities. It's like you show them a photograph of a cookie on the ground, and it's like you wouldn't eat the cookie kind of thing. And then you raise that level to a USB drive, a thumb drive on the ground. It's like you wouldn't plug this into your laptop or your company network. And then you just show them all of the different command lines for go get npm build. Like it's like all of the ways that we casually allow people to slurp buckets of stuff in, that they never question that dependency. And it's understanding that you have a software dependency now. And okay, so maybe it's a fairly low level dependency. Maybe it really doesn't matter that you snuffled up a dozen npm packages. But if it starts becoming mission critical, how much do you invest back upstream? And I hate this. You have to give back. No, you don't. It had an open source license on it. Like there is nothing in that exchange that requires me to give back out of some altruistic, hey, I'm making money, I should give some of it back. No, there isn't. License says so. But you have an enormous responsibility to your customers, to your users, even if they're internal users, to be able to support the dependency you just took. And
because the license says as is.
Yeah. And so
the
it's
obligation or lack of goes both directions. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, when you look at the dependencies, okay, so is it, Red Hat used to have a rule of thumb. They would not ship anything that they had not proved that they could get a patch upstream. Okay, so that feels like a good minimum bar, especially coming out of the engineering culture at Red Hat. Okay, so this is I've taken a dependency. Did I build it from source? Do I know how to build it? Does it come from a single company that could change the license? These are questions you might ask. As you step into that next thing of, no, this is actually pretty critical. Okay, can you get a patch upstream? I'm not saying, are you a maintainer? I'm just saying, could you make a contribution and it landed? Okay, that would seem to be important. Okay, is it so critical? Is this dependency so critical that maybe you actually want to get a lot of patches upstream and become a maintainer? Okay, is it so critical? It's the Linux kernel and you're Red Hat. It's the Linux kernel and you're Microsoft building Azure Linux. Maybe we need a number of maintainers kind of thing. Maybe we need to go join whatever the thing is, whatever that nonprofit structure is. Maybe there's lots of different investments that we should be making around that open source licensed project because it's critical to our borrow and share strategy for how we took those dependencies. And that's the thing, like all of the we should be able to fund our open source developers. I'm not saying it's a lost cause. I just don't see the economics being sustainable. We saw companies try this, and that's where, there's still a couple of companies that are in the current space, but Source Labs failed. Spike Source failed. I'm blanking on the name of the one that actually was the one company that figured out how to support and sustain open source projects for customers for money. They realized that there is no, if you're going to provide an SLA around some of these packages, you need staff. And so
there's OpenLogic, if that's who you were thinking
thank
of.
you. It was OpenLogic. Yeah. So OpenLogic figured this out, God, 20 years ago almost. And they didn't have a home run kind of exit. They got acquired by RogueWave, I think. When RogueWave finally figured, a dozen years ago that we really need to get on board with this open source stuff, and there seems to be a company here that knows how to do it. So this idea that we're going to create something that could provide an economic structure, for profit or not, that is going to somehow flow money at an SLA level for consumers down to loan developers. It's like, I don't see it.
In this segment, Clare Dillon talks about what skills and motivations individuals gain when they start to contribute to inner source or open source projects, and what you can lose if you don't let them continue to do so.
I'm curious, Clare, again, leveraging the inner source experience of teams that then go on to do more in the open source ecosystem. Have you found that they have a better understanding as to what are the general costs of upkeep of an open source project? Again, you can talk about, getting past the point of organizations being comfortable with contributing upstream. But then the second order effect of that is somebody has to review that code. Somebody has to be responsible for getting it in. And so when we hear in the open source ecosystem about maintainer burnout, it's usually because they're either a hobbyist and they've become far too popular to actually maintain the level of work that is involved in taking contributions from others, or it's a developer who's paid by his organization to do work in Linux or any other project, but they're only being really paid to do the feature development that the company needs, not the responsibilities of a maintainer that this person has risen to because of his technical competence and what he's done and his ability to gain influence in that ecosystem. So do you see any better cognition of folks who have done inner source to the additional costs of open source upkeep in the external world, or maybe not so much?
Well, I mightn't phrase it as being aware of the explicit costs. I don't think. I mean, in many respects, I mean, this may be again a gross generalization, but I'm not sure many developers would be making that value decision as to that kind of cost investment. Like, as you mentioned, either they're doing it because it's part of their job to do it, and they've been assigned that task, responsibility, to do that, and they're not necessarily thinking about the cost or anything like that.
Right.
What I will say is that once you have people working in that way, in the way of collaboration, like just in that open collaborative way, they like it better. So the conversation I've heard more is like, I want to do more, and how do I convince my boss that I can do more? So it's maybe it's less of them making a value decision to say, I'm going to independently decide as to whether or not my activities as a maintainer is going to give an ROI to my host company. It's not that. They're not making that kind of decision.
No. Well, I would
But
expect that to be a decision for the management. And that's kind of what I was asking.
Oh, right. Oh, so in terms of the management, well, I mean, I do think so. It's interesting. What I've seen three, maybe if I talk about three types of scenarios in terms of the relationship between inner source and open source. The first is where someone has already made the decision, like management would have made the decision and understood the value of actually contributing to the open source ecosystem for whatever their motivation. And then they are using inner source as a way to get ready for open source, like very explicitly. We're doing it in a safe environment first because we don't want to do this in the wild with our developers who've never done this before. We want to get them experienced. We want to make sure the documentation's in place. We want to make sure that they understand what a pull request means. What really annoys people, what gets people on board, like all of those kind of behaviors and processes they can put in place before they go and do it in the wild. And then they're better able to be more successful by making those first experiences great when they go out into the open source environment. So that's one scenario. And that has been the case study, and it certainly was the case studies for an awful lot of our early inner source adopters. That was explicitly what they were trying to do. Okay. Then you have the people who build something with inner source, realize they've got something that's really sticky. Like so, and I'll point to things like Backstage, like in terms of the actual developer portal, that was being built by Spotify as an inner source project. Then they realized, hey, this is popular in terms of internal in Spotify. And then they're like, this might be popular external to Spotify. We could do something with this. And so that was almost, it wasn't necessarily, I don't believe it was from the get-go intended to be an open source project, but because they were able to successfully do it as an inner source project, they'll be like, well, we can get even more value if we make it external. And so that was an evolution from inner source to open source, as opposed to we always knew that was our end destination.
Right.
So that would be the second scenario. And then the third scenario, which maybe I don't know if management maybe are planning for it, but I do think it's going to become. I think indirectly they see the value. Would be this idea of the fact that if you have people who are experienced in doing inner source and do it well, and like working in that way, sometimes when they get involved in the open source projects, whether or not their management tells them to stay at it, they do. I mean, we have this thing about, certainly in Inner Source Commons, there was all this big conversation of whether or not if people were doing inner source as their job, would they stay if that stopped being their job? And I think what we've experienced is that, you may come for your job, but you stay for the community. So in as much as some people may leave for a while, they come back or they stay altogether because they just like the community. So whether or not that is either an explicit goal of management from the get-go or becomes an evolved goal of management as they see the value, there is a indirect impact, which means that people who start working in this way want to do more in the community because they enjoy it from their personal perspective. Now, whether that's a satisfaction angle or maybe even a kind of a reputational, like building my experience angle, or they're doing it for knowledge gain, or they're doing it so that they can change career paths or whatever. But there's all sorts of motivation that happen at that individual level that I think, regardless of whether management explicitly wanted or not, they build people like maintainers and community managers and all those folks that become successful in an open source project. They're building the kinds of skills that management wants, like organizational development people keep going, we want leaders who can communicate and get people to collaborate. And you're like, oh, there they are. You just built them. So, but without even knowing it, they're building the skills of the workforce of the future. So in that respect, whether or not they continue showing that value internally or externally, that by practicing those skills, they're providing value to the organization. Do management and folks know that? I know they know that it's a place to go to get talent. So I know they know that it's helping them in their recruitment. They're seeing value in that respect. I know they know it's helping them in terms of skills development, and in terms of relationship building in the field. So they're seeing value in that respect. Are they explicitly sending people out because of those things to begin with? Maybe not, but they see value in it.
In this segment, Wayne Starr talks about fears and challenges that he helped people overcome when they were considering to use and get involved in open source projects. a bit back to the this how to explain open source to people. Like in your experience, are there any sort of recurring questions or like the top three concerns that people often have, especially if they are less familiar with open source, like the whole methodology and how the communities work and how they produce the software and how can anyone ever trust that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a couple things usually around like the sort of national security questions of like what happens if our adversaries see something. So what happens if I don't know, Iran starts using Zarf? Like this is a U.S. Department of Defense project that is being integrated into U.S. weapon systems. Are we giving a defense technology to potentially to a foreign adversary? So that's a potential interesting question because a lot of businesses have a similar question about like if we open source this core technology, couldn't competitors use it too? But at the national scale, it's a little bit different. The way that I usually would answer that though is that yes, we're giving it to everyone, but we're giving it to individual people as well, to the people of say Iran, and if they want to use it to bring air gap software to for their own needs and for their own purposes, they can do that too. And their government is more threatened by that than our government is, and so it kind of like evens out in the end. So yeah.
That's an interesting approach. I hadn't really thought of that when I was curious to see how you would answer that question. That's an interesting approach.
Yep.
It's equally evil to everybody. So
to everybody, yes, yeah. You just have to learn how to deal with it. It's just the way the world is. So that's a common question. And then the other one is like, how do you manage contributors to a project, and how do you know who these people are? And a lot of that is just through the practices that we have on our own projects. We have a core group of maintainers on them, but then for any external PRs, regardless of whatever, we require two maintainers to approve those PRs. And so we make sure that the code getting into the project is solid, and it is backed. And obviously we do our own checks and things. We try to live in many ways what we preach, and so we try to SBOM and CV scan our own software and deliver it securely. And so all that stuff kind of helps to sort of mitigate a lot of that.
So these answers usually resonate with people, or did you have different answers and then they evolved into what they are today as you learned more about what people are mostly skeptical about when it comes to open source?
I think it mostly was like kind of came from a lot of the stuff that had been done before. So I think we already had these answers for the most part for open source. Because when I was at Defense Innovation Unit before, a lot of what they were trying to do was bring commercial technologies into the Department of Defense. They weren't focused on bringing open source technologies, but it was more about how do you invest in a startup that has a dual use technology and give like money to them, investment money to them to bring their technology into the DoD. And similar questions would come up. What happens if I don't know, a Chinese investment firm invests in this company, and then do we want to even touch that company? And then trying to their work in educating the government about, no, it's fine, we should invest, because if we basically like let that one go, then we're just like letting the technology go, and we're never going to be able to take advantage of it. And we won't be able to have influence over it either. So it's just kind of a moot point. So I think a lot of the discussions that happened during that time kind of flowed into what became Defense Unicorns and some of the way that we're answering some of the open source questions as well.
So at the end of the day, most of the things are not necessarily that different from the usual business, corporate, proprietary world compared to open source. Okay.
Yeah. It's just a different scale, slightly.
Oh, yes. Did you experience any like new challenges with people accepting open source after the Exe news broke? Like after all that happened, like did you have to explain open source again to someone who was kind of starting to build up trust that open source software, we can use it, it's okay, we can contribute back, it's all okay. Like, did it kind of like destroy any of that educational work that for instance you were doing up to that point, or it didn't really make a difference in that sense?
I think it may have hurt a little bit, but I do think that once we can kind of like look at the situation, what happened, and kind of explain how it's different. And again, to Phil's point, comparing it to SolarWinds and how that it is actually very different in both scenarios, and how in some ways open source in this case was more secure than it was when it was closed source. I think that people recognize and start resonating with that, and then it becomes less of a problem. But we definitely got questions about certain things, but I think once you come up with logical answers to them, then people can understand and then become educated on it.
So it didn't cause any problems that you could not overcome once you explained the background of the situation?
Yeah, not for us and our customers. We do tend to work with a lot more of the forward-leaning folks within the Department of Defense, so that also helps, obviously. But yeah, at least for us, we didn't really see a ton of impact for it.
But like you said, the folks that are actually the implementers of your air-gapped solutions, where Zarf is leading that way, they are probably not those forward-leaning folks.
Yeah, sometimes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, you have to balance it. Luckily, the way that everything kind of the chain of commands work, it usually winds up working out. And as long as you can answer the other things that they care about along the way, then they're willing to accept it, and they'll see the value in it as well. So one of the things that SBOMs with Zarf, they're baked into the package, and so they come with the package. And an information assurance person within the Department of Defense, if they're more traditionalistic, one of the very first things they're going to ask is, what software are you bringing into my environment? And that's a valid question, and they'll want to do a risk assessment analysis on everything. But because Zarf it has SBOMs baked into it and very easily answers that question, they actually wind up liking it and being like, oh, this thing solves this big problem that I've always fought with developers on for so long. Because there honestly has been this kind of developer information assurance kind of rivalry where one side tries to get around the other side, and the other side doesn't trust the other side and stuff. And so in some ways, Zarf can kind of come in between both of those, help the developer get their stuff in the air gap and discover what images are needed and package it all up, but also have features that help the other side understand what's being brought in and then bridge them together to go into the environment.
Sounds like DevOps versus the security guys before SecOps existed.
Yep. It is.
So would you say that a good strategy is to try to cover a diverse set of topics when someone is advocating for an open source project, like showing the value in multiple angles, that yes, this has happened, but this is also what this open source project is providing to you, and helping people understand the different bits and pieces and components? Is that a key to the argument, or did you find any other ways to help that kind of talking up the chain a little bit about what this whole thing is that you all are working on?
Yeah, so it is definitely, I think a lot of it is understanding the personas that are users of your application, and who and the environments that you're going into. We have a lot of veterans at our company, and so a lot of people like myself who have seen these arguments happen in real life, between developers and information assurance people, and know what they're looking for and have seen it. And so I think that helps us to be able to sort of see both sides, both sides' problems, and then answer to both of them. And then talking to the chain of commands thing, it is important to know about what is coming out of the White House or different policy documents. There was an executive order a little bit ago on SBOMs, which drives it across all defense contractors, and then knowing how to position your products, Zarf, which already had SBOM support at that time, underneath that and with that, and say, okay, it can not only help you with your problems here, but it also helps you with this other thing that you're going to have to be in compliance with here very shortly. And so there are things that are happening even with potentially attestations and stuff with NIST and some of the documents they're putting out. And so trying to watch some of the stuff that's happening in that compliance realm, in the policy realm, and then understanding what these users on the ground are going to want and experience as well. I think kind of bridging that is what makes it successful.
Vex lists are another things that the CISA has been starting to push. Are those tied into your SBOMs, and how do you manage vulnerabilities that are identified in the components that you're using and the backports that you've done to fix or what have you?
Yeah, right now we haven't incorporated Vex into Zarf, but it is on something that we're looking at for the roadmap. It is something that we think would be very important to be able to bring that across the air gap. One of the things we're trying to work on is allowing people to scan for vulnerabilities within their environment as well. And so we're building some. We have another open source product, which is the Unicorn Delivery Service, which is kind of how we wrap most of our open source products in like a cohesive solution for people. And so we're looking at how we can implement like scanning tools into that to bring in the SBOMs from Zarf, but also like trivia vulnerability databases, and then Vex data and other things to sort of build a full picture for these security personas.
In this segment, Stephen Walli talks about the challenges of creating reproducible builds based on his experience working for Microsoft. And in the area of software bill of materials, you can also learn why one SBOM is just not enough.
There was a couple of things that I learned about the way Microsoft builds software since I went to my first reproducible builds summit. And for perfectly rational reasons to best serve and secure our customers, I was barely home from the reproducible build summit, and somebody was saying, well, you realize once we build, what does it mean to build the binaries for Windows? There's a question for you. When you realize that as a user installing it on your laptop or PC, you're already in this huge complex binary installation experience of here's the core, but here's these 5 things that have to work together, and then I'm going to click on these things. And then there's the whole driver background of, as you plug in a device, different things happen. But there's also a period where in a place in that build cycle where apparently historically we would crack open the binaries we had built and scribble on them for a very particular security reason that we had learned painfully over the previous, couple of decades of shipping Windows. I'm not sure what that means to a reproducible build.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it means to a modern SBOM for that matter. The idea that, here's the SBOM up to this point where we cracked open the binary and wrote on it kind of thing. And it's like, having lived inside of Microsoft with its focus on keeping customers happy and the extreme attack surface we represent because of how successful we've been as a producer of software, there is like we've got very good at certain very large scale engineering problems in the software space that you don't hear of other companies. Like other companies go, why would you do that? And it's like, well, because we learned this very painful way that we had to do it this way to ensure that the software was secure, watermarked, stamped in a particular way, protected, and it's so, this idea that we can come up with one tool set for everybody, I think is not so sure. There was even at last Monday when we were all at the conference, Kate Stewart, who sits at the heart of a lot of the SBOM discussions, gave a brilliant state of the SBOM
SBOMs.
And it was I don't think it was longer than 15 minutes, but it was this perfect presentation that said, here's how we got to where we are today, and all of the rich complexity of what it means to be building an SBOM, what kind of SBOM being used for what, and how would you build it and or query it to learn. Yeah, it was an amazing summary of the state where we are, and pointers off to all of the things you would have to read to even begin to understand it as well as she does. And then but already we saw later in the week a keynote where, a respected person in our industry stood up and said, now we're going to apply it to hardware, supply chains. And it was like, there's a certain amount of, I am thinking you don't fully understand the problem and you haven't solved it for software yet. And the idea that you're just going to trivially extend this format to cover all of these other situations, I'm pretty sure you want to pause for a bit, kind of. So we live in a complex world.
Yeah.
That we do. And we also have a podcast episode out with Ava Black where we talk about the security aspects of open source and how non-trivial and non-solved the challenges are.
Yeah, and Ava's fantastic because they are one of those engineers that can start talking to you about, okay, the electrons are hitting the board. Now here's all of the things that will start to happen through all of the levels. And the joy of having worked with them is they can continue up that stack into, beyond the hardware. Now here's the social levels of regulatory things that you need to consider as well.
Yep.
And it's just that ability to be able to talk about how all of the layers in the discussion relate. I hope Ava's podcast covers some of that richness.
We went into some of the details, but there's only so much you can cover in
Right.
Such short amount of time that we have on these recordings.
Well, that's what I thought was so fascinating about Kate's presentation is it was like 15 minutes and you came out of it realizing there's a lot here. There's a lot beyond
work
what
to
I
do.
thought I understood. All the pointers are here. And still she managed to lay out that, kind of the map of the territory in 15 minutes for you. It's like compare that to how long I've been rambling. It's like I wish I could speak that tightly, or I could figure out how to focus it down that cleanly.
Yeah. That presentation in particular was a really good explanation as to why people getting software on the runtime and the deployment side aren't really seeing what's being reported when you try to do the SBOM at the build or the intake side.
Right.
Because there are too many things that are happening in between. Just the recognition that there need to be different SBOMs that are correlated was, for me, the power of that talk.
Right, exactly. Well, and there was even the protobomb work that was released or announced last week. I think the thing that's interesting there is, so there was a bit of a misunderstanding, I think, in the way it was presented in kind of the press releases and by the journalists copying the press releases. Protobomb is a library of tools for basically a translation library. So you can take any of the existing formats, the popular ones, and slurp that SBOM in that format into a generalized form that can then be manipulated in very powerful ways as a developer, and then translated back out cleanly with fidelity into any of the other formats. And so I think it's Protobomb is a really powerful library that, folks can start to go and use. But it's a translation library. It's not actually a producer of SBOMs kind of thing. And so, it's a tool that you could probably use that way. But I think, we're just at the front end of starting to figure this out. And, unfortunately, fortunately, we have the accelerant of, government level. In the EU, we've got the Cyber Resiliency Act breathing down its neck. Here, we've got the executive order from the president's office a couple of years ago. These are forcing discussions almost too quickly as people try for a land grab. But it's a really interesting challenge right now.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is.
That's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you